Thank you all for joining. Hopefully we'll have Eric join us shortly. I have a few things I want to kind of begin with. Good afternoon to everybody. And if you're logging in from a different time zone, good morning, good evening, good morning. I am Swamy Kocherlakota. I'm the EVP and the Global CIO of S&P Global and the WSTA Director. We would like to welcome and thank Blue Prism for being the sponsor of our first Ask the Expert session. And a special thanks to Dr. Eric Maloney of Blue Prism for taking the time out of his busy schedule to participate. Thank you all for joining again. Before I begin, it will be a missed opportunity if I don't mention the events of the last 2 weeks. The brutal killing of George Floyd. We need to mention George Floyd to recognize and acknowledge how much progress we need to make. This is the time to listen, learn, and action at all levels and in all of our interactions. I really thank you for listening to me on this topic. I've been associated with the WSTA, Wall Street Technology Association, for almost 12 or maybe even 14 years. I joined as a member of the content committee and contributed there significantly before being part of the board member. Probably I'm the longest serving board member, and I must say that I have had the privilege to meet a lot of people because of WSTA. WSTA is a nonprofit organization and a community with a focus on enabling you and the future leaders of Wall Street with connections, knowledge, and helping you navigate your career. With COVID, we are getting global as well. So we ask you and encourage you to share event information with your colleagues, regardless of where they are located. Once we're able to meet in person, we will continue to offer virtual events to make it easier for members to attend from anywhere. Personally, I can say that joining virtual events is much more easier than having to go to Midtown. So you certainly will see me more often in WSTA and in other forms as well. Be sure to visit www.wsta.org for upcoming events and stay engaged with the WSTA on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Couple of housekeeping items for today's session. You are all on mute. Please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions today. At the end of today's virtual event, an evaluation form will pop up. We would sincerely and greatly appreciate if you could complete it, as it helps us plan future events. With that, Eric.
Thank you very much. I do like the virtual events. As you can see, I enjoy my virtual background. It's a pleasant place to be online like this. I want to thank you and WSTA for your invitation. I was fortunate enough to be part of an event in person in Midtown earlier in the year. It was very fun and interactive. About 100 or so people in the room. It was kind of exciting to see the diversity of backgrounds and organizations that are represented in the room. I also really have been enjoying WSTA myself for about 20 plus years, almost the full lifespan of the organization. I was invited to talk about the early days of virtualization and open source when I worked on Wall Street. So I've seen the impact that WSTA has had as a forum, as a networking organization, and I think it's going to go broader and in more interesting ways as a result of COVID-19. And as I'm going to discuss today, we're going to see many organizations just accelerate the transformation because of COVID-19. But before we go into that, just a little background on myself. I am the Director of Strategy at Blue Prism for our advisory partners. So my primary customers, so to speak, would be the McKinseys and Bain Capitals of the world. I also deal with other advisory groups within larger consultancies, and I also deal with our strategic partners and customers. I look at our larger partner ecosystem because the future is really an agile development, agile delivery. It requires you to have the best of breed available. And so because I'm dealing with advisories on the future of work and really digital workforce. And that requires me to understand what's happening in the emerging technology space for AI or in security or blockchain services. So it drives the conversation in so many different directions, but it all comes back to delivery. How's the workforce of tomorrow going to operate, and how's it going to be leveraged? And I think that we've seen in the last few months just how important it is to assess how work gets done, because the old ideas of business continuity were kind of proven wrong over the last several weeks. We were all prepared for a major storm or another natural disaster on the scale of days or a week, but when you couldn't have people get back to their desks weeks on end, it really proved that business resiliency is really what you have to plan for. And what are the contingencies for working remotely indefinitely, or having worked on-prem with limited human interaction? And that's really the segue into talking about the digital transformation right now with the next generation of automation. So before we go on, I just, as you can see on the screen, a reference here to the COVID-19 response at Blue Prism. You can find links here to how we can help not just our customers, but anybody needing automation to fill the gap, so to speak, in these difficult times to maintain business processes. Also, there are links to our partner ecosystem where we have intelligence partners, OCR, ICR partners, process design partners who are also opening up their services and trying to be giving in this time where people need to assess and shore up their business continuity strategies through and past COVID-19. So with that, I think that finishes my introduction, and I'll pass it back to Swamy to start our dialogue.
Thank you. This is our first event using a video technology with somebody orchestrating when the video is off and when the audio is off. So please hang in there, participants. I also see the questions that are coming in. So Eric, this COVID is really moved the future to forward a lot faster than what we are ready for. So tell me what you're hearing from your customers about the role of automation and how automation is now going to be either more accelerated, or are we de-accelerating automation specific to in light of COVID?
Well, thank you. It's actually, I like the choice of words. It is accelerating conversations. It's putting things on the table now that we're setting a stage for just a few months ago. And it's really not an either-or conversation. Really, before COVID-19, where we're talking about how to enable productivity, how to enable people to do more work, how to enable people to do things more critically important to an organization. And everyone associated basic RPA is productivity. How do you take hours and convert them into digital worker hours so people aren't as necessary? And that really wasn't the message before. And it's hard to convey to people. That's only an aspect of what you can do with intelligent automation. But intelligent automation is how do you commercialize AI services? How do you use AI services to do proactive work? Transforming the nature of work rather than mimicking what people do with digital workers. And what happened with COVID-19 is it accelerated, as you said, those conversations, because you now are one or two people or one or two groups away from having an inability to access office or to fall ill, that supply chains are at risk. Accounts payable and executing contracts are at risk. Fundamental things that allow corporate America to work, or hospitals or nonprofits to operate. They also have to keep the lights on. They also have to have back office work done. And we found out that on almost an instant, people got it. It wasn't that we were there to take away people doing their jobs. We were there to help enable people to get those jobs done. How do you shore up those decision processes in the supply chain? How do you add a more automated mechanism to accounts payable and accounting due diligence? How do you expand things like VPN access for those people working remotely? So we're in IT risk, where people weren't thinking about anything other than traditional scripting technologies. Now they're looking at the value of having an interactive relationship with the digital worker, where once you give it new tasks, recognize a new group, you can train it very quickly to extend those access rights to similar groups and follow the protocol and reporting. So it's transformed that whole conversation. I heard one of our advisories say a conversation that used to take 3 years is now taking 30 days.
Right. Excellent. You know, when I think about what is happening based upon COVID, it's almost like we need to kind of separate the timeline into like a pre-COVID and a post-COVID, right? You know, much like it's like a pre.com and post.com, you know, and so on and so forth. If you look at the progress that the organizations have to make, and I look at them, Eric, as trajectories. You got like a business trajectory, and then you have a internal operational trajectory, and then developers and revenues. Before COVID, we had trajectories and strategies and vision and execution plans for all of them, right? So from where I sit, what we're seeing is that COVID has really is going to change some of the trajectories, and the trajectory that I think is going to have a huge impact on how work is getting done, where work is getting done, and more importantly, how we engage with the knowledge workers is also going to change. So in talking to your partners and customers, what is the one that's on the top of their mind, in your view, as a concern when it comes to where and how the work is getting done and engaging with the knowledge workers?
So I like to think of digital workers in three tiers, or three realms. And you can leverage all three, but generally you can start with the most foundational, which is productivity, mimicking human behavior to carry out complex, mundane, or error-prone chores, tasks. And those are pretty straightforward, rules-based training for a digital worker. The second tier would be intelligent automation, which is now you're wedding a digital worker to one or more AI or ML services. And think about how much training and the complexity of monetizing an AI service usually entails. But now if you train the digital worker to opportunistically invoke that AI or ML service, it's a lot easier to adopt, it's a lot easier to audit, it's a lot easier to control and cover spend with. But finally, it's that end state, which is, I think the digital workforce of the future is what you said earlier about knowledge workers. The knowledge workers with AI ML services, with digital workers, is the digital workforce of the future. So what's happening now is we're coming to grips with defining what a knowledge worker is, and in the future, post-COVID-19, what we expect from them. So people who do project work, people who do strategy work, I think I'm in a good place, fortunately, as a strategist, people who are going to be more on the negotiation side, able to understand and exercise empathy with customers, with partners, with other employees, those will be the thought leaders of tomorrow. What's interesting is EY and I think it was Robert Half and Company and others, they were actually looking about 3 years out. And they were saying it's interesting that if you looked at something like finance and accounting as an internal practice or as a financial institution, if you looked at finance and accounting hiring practices over the next 3 to 5 years, they were talking about these soft skills. They were talking about project management skills. They were talking about people who understood systems, data structure, and understood risk and security more intimately. People who could do more planning for adjacent or new product offerings, upselling. The one thing that you didn't see on these strategies of the resources that you needed in these groups were people with CPA degrees, were people who actually knew deep accounting, because the technology is already there. You train a digital worker once to understand the tax codes for the coming fiscal year, they can collect the right data, format and report on that data. You just need somebody to review it for completeness and to validate that it's being processed on behalf of an organization, and you're done. So you're going to see these thought leaders, these information workers you're talking about, defining the new frontiers. And thanks to COVID-19, we have to define new frontiers about, to your other point, where are people going to work? Virtual teams and collaboration. Zoom is good, but if you also read the news, Zoom is tenuous. Even though we're having a Zoom conference now, we have to worry about the security. We have to worry about the access. We have to worry about the retrievability of the information that we're presenting here. Imagine as part of the future, you're going to have a digital coworker who's going to take notes in these meetings and index everything and archive it for you and recall it if you need to show it to a risk and compliance organization or to a prospect or for education. And so I think the future is going to be a lot different. A lot of the pressure on people to get it right is going to go away. I think you're going to see a lot more of the 80-20 rule enabled by digital workers. Because once you define the mundane and silly stuff that you do every day that takes up, a major percentage of your time, and you learn to automate that on the side, and you have trust it's being done the way you wanted it, it frees up more of your day to do more interesting things, more high value things. And I mentioned a few there about maybe upselling, maybe cross-organizational collaboration, things that people do, and they do well if given the time. And I think as you march forward, you want to have this balance of work between people and services, and people and these digital workers. So you keep moving that bar up, and it stays up. Because if we all go through COVID-19 and say, oh, okay, we survived this and we revert, this opportunity to be agile, this opportunity to engage new services in a more flexible manner, this ability to engage your IT risk organization and have a mature discussion about what needs to be done, how it's going to be done, and how you're going to respond to compliance and audits going forward. You don't want to lose that momentum.
And I'm very excited about one thing that you mentioned there, which is the notion about a digital twin. And having a digital twin that you could delegate some of your work to and automate it. That way you can actually focus on more intelligent, that's really the combination of the human-assisted, ML-assisted automation is a very powerful concept. We have a couple of pre-submitted questions, and then questions are coming up. Please type your questions in the Q&A panel. There's a question that came up, and then I'll take a stab at it, and then Eric will see if anything that you would want to add there. What return to workplace strategies are you employing, and how are you addressing challenges associated with contact tracing? Maybe at S&P Global, we are a company that has 35 countries in which we operate with 80 plus locations where we have offices with 23,000 employees spread across. So we cannot have like one return to office strategies. So what we have done is, what exactly are all the we have made it very regional and very local, in the sense that what is the local authorities are saying about the risk for opening and coming back to office. And then we are collecting and overlaying that with a lot of data that we can get from whether it's Johns Hopkins or RT Live. There are many sources, and we are overlaying that. And then we are also looking at what is the schools, what is the policy for the schools, and what are the school districts that are doing, are the schools opening? And we kind of blended all of that into like a risk score on what is the risk from a COVID perspective in each location we have offices. And then if the risk is high, the conversation of return to office and opening that office is not a factor. So we're taking a very methodical approach in terms of making that analysis on which offices we want to prioritize. And there are some locations where we already have return to work, specifically in China and Hong Kong, and in a couple of locations, and in a couple of locations in US, we are evaluating. And then there's a second dimension. There's this new area that's coming up, is what we are seeing as infection risk management. So this infection risk management has to be managed much like you have other risks in the company, whether it is business continuity risk, cyber risk, and so on and so forth. So this this whole, infection risk management has to be a platform, and that platform should be sustainable, because we don't know if there's a COVID-20, 21, 23 that's coming in. And then even if we come out of COVID-19, 3, 4, 5 years from now, if some pandemic comes in, we have to make sure that we learn all the lessons and institutionalize the processes. So the way we are looking at is, what is the infection risk management platform? And then working with our counterparts in legal on what are the privacy rules, and with respect to contact tracing, we are now saying, we look at each location as an entity. As long as an employee comes into the building, we could trace the contact, but inside the floor, what floor they are on, there are a lot of privacy and regulatory issues that we have to deal with, that we are mulling all of those things. But we are taking a very methodical approach. 99.9% of our workforce is working remotely, and all of our business is doing fantastic at this point of time. And what we don't want to be one of the first people who have to come to work, neither we want to be last. So we're also kind of watching to see what lessons that we can learn, so we can take a methodical approach. That's what we're doing at S&P Global. We're looking at a lot of technology and tools that can help us in managing this in a sustainable, scalable way. Eric, you have any thoughts that you want to share on that?
Well, a few. First off, that was a very thorough overview of S&P's approach, and you need the data. I think that you're correct. Everything it starts with the data. First, you're defining the new metrics. You're defining new inputs, like you said, from Johns Hopkins and now with the infectious disease profiling. The only thing I want to add to that is it's going to be dynamic. You can't write a static script. You can't get all the rules right at once, because the rules will change in the second wave of COVID-19, or as you said, COVID-20 or 21. It is also going to be the next challenge may not be purely or directly health related. It may be supply chain related. It could be energy disruptions or other food disruption or water disruptions, because we're living in a world of, we realize, finite resources that are going to be reallocated and access is not continuous. So the new normal is being nimble. And we have mantras of all the agility that we want to do. And what I'm being part of conversations with is, from risk officers to operations, is how do you kind of have exceptions built in? How do you have, with a notification that a site which was clear or clean, that you just got a warning? What's the ripple effect for all the approved travel, for all of the approved supporting services? How do they come up? You're going to have these scenarios built on the data that you're collecting. And it's interesting how the larger advisories and other consultancies are putting a tremendous amount of work into the business resiliency space. And I think you're going to see that, automation plays a role. AI and ML algorithms are being rewritten to have much more in the modeling space. And I think it starts with you. It starts with the enterprise. Because when you start defining that, I used to call it outcome selling, but now I call it outcome planning. What is the outcome you're going to shoot for by line of business within your larger organizational goals, to make sure that you have persistent endpoints that you're shooting for? And then the processes will be built and modeled to achieve that or protect that outcome that you're shooting for. And I think it's amazing right now how much new thought and planning is going into this space. I'm seeing whole new fields of study. Human capital management software, which was barely an understood term 6 months ago, is something coming into play now, because you have to understand the skills of people, when and where they're going to be applied, to your earlier points. What skills are going to be provided by services or by a digital worker? And your point earlier, I'd like to just come back on this idea of digital twin. The digital twin is an enabling idea. It's not just simply that you have an avatar of yourself someplace. It's really whatever you as an individual need to do your job more efficiently in a sustainable way. You're going to want a digital twin that can ingest lots of emails and lots of documents and get to the important stuff and archive the rest. So a digital twin can do a lot of work for you that you won't have to do, but still give you the result of that if you train it to discern the information you want, as an example. A digital twin could be out on the marketplace, culling information, gathering your own news feed, if that's what you want your digital twin to do. So it's kind of having superpowers for a digital self. And it's not in a sense to diminish you. It's, as I said earlier, I'm going to use this word over and over again, to enable you. It's good, and you and your organization, to enable the organization. That's why the digital twin concept is taking off. It hasn't gotten a firm definition to it yet. That's why I'm kind of using this little forum here to put some of my my spin on it. But we're reaching a point where with COVID-19, one old idea that's new again is, if you might remember, there were these companies for 100, 200 years called representative companies. If your company was too small to have a sales force in every market, you would have a representative company in a small market or a distant market for you, and they would represent many companies, and they knew enough not to be dangerous. They knew enough to qualify leads. They knew enough to attend a meeting, collect some empirical information, exchange some information, and then deliver that back to a company that wanted to be represented, and then they would actually move on. Because now, if it was a valid lead, the client would pick up the direct communication. Imagine now, in the age of 5G and digital workers and digital twins, you're going to have a lot more virtual interaction to qualify the human interaction. And all the collateral from that inquiry and qualification will be rendered back to the people through their presence through digital twins and other methods going forward. So work will not be the same in the future. We haven't defined all the working parts yet, but we know directionally what it's going to feel like, and the reasons it has to, because you can have every good plan in the world, but every good plan has to be trued up and rewritten. And the more that you have some of those modeling capabilities, and you have the ability of training a digital worker to say, this is BAU, but if any of these variables happen, send out these notices and start changing. And then I think that's going to be part of the new resiliency planning.
So there's another question, what aspect of COVID-19 and working remotely has surprised you? And let me take a stab at it. One of the things that we have done at S&P Global 3 years ago, we took a bold bet that we're going to be a cloud first and mobile first. And again, this is something that's on the minds of the CIOs across the board, but we focused on it and delivered our cloud and mobile first strategy. And as a result, I'm very surprised that when we had COVID, what happened is, because we moved 65% of the workload into the cloud, and we also have enabled a lot of SaaS applications, a lot of our employees can use the SaaS applications, whether it's Office 365, Zoom, Teams, in a workday, without having to come to the VPN. And also the employees who needs to access the business applications because they're available on the cloud, it's like having direct access to the highway, don't have to kind of have that traffic come to a central data center and then distribute it. So the big surprise to me is that, yes, there are advantages for the cloud. I did not know that our cloud strategy and executing would come in very, very handy in COVID, from a performance perspective and employee experience perspective, or even customer experience. We did not have any issues. So Eric, based on what you're hearing from your customers and at the Blue Prism, what is a big lesson learned and surprise resulting from COVID-19?
Well, actually, I like to bring up that example, and we didn't rehearse that question because we just received it from the audience. I actually wrote a white paper about 2 months ago about business resiliency, and I wrote up some scenarios. And one of the scenarios for legacy on-prem applications that people cannot reach because they're not at their desktops with their thick clients, how are they going to interact with those applications? And so a possibility is that you would define a digital worker to carry out key functions, and it would be on-prem, living with the application. And a remote worker could send emails to the digital worker saying, can you run this report? Can you give me an update on some particular information? And then it would either email or through some other secure channel send that information back. What's interesting is we don't appreciate, you're a complex organization. I've been dealing with S&P for a couple of years, but you have invested in modernization. And as you mentioned earlier, you do have quite a few SaaS. You had some pleasant surprises because you'd already transitioned to some cloud services that enabled what you wanted to do. Most public sector are not that fortunate. Most larger organizations that are more than 40 years old have legacy platform that it's very difficult to access remotely. The applications don't have the necessary security capabilities to be accessed, even with the VPN gateway. They need to be certified by your IT risk. So it was very surprising that I wrote that paper, had it published. Within 24 hours, I was speaking to 2 different consultancies. And later the same week, I was speaking to a consortium of hospitals in North America. And they're like, we need this because we can't get our back office people into hospitals to carry out the paperwork to make sure we have the PPE and other things ordered to stay in the hospital. These are not critical people to serve patients, but they're critical to keep the institution running. And so they ran into the problem you pointed out, but they didn't have a position of strength. They couldn't pivot to the SaaS services. So they had to kind of invent a poor man's SaaS service. But the experience of realizing that and the experience of learning what are the key functions that you need to automate is setting them up for future success. Because as they come out of this wave and they have a chance to breathe, they can shore up, as you said earlier, for whatever the next contingency has to be planned for. So the surprise was going low tech in a sense is positioning people to deal with some legacy systems they've never rationalized before. And the methods that they're using will help them for designing future workflow.
Excellent. So we have a question from the audience here. Again, please keep asking questions in the Q&A. Much emphasis has been placed on the associate, when it comes to automation. And then the question is, do you expect a push into tools for remote management and adjustments to onboarding/offboarding?
So I can start with that, or you
Yeah, go for it, Eric.
So long before COVID-19, automation of know your customer, onboarding and offboarding are kind of, for our company, this is a bread and butter type thing, because these are very mundane series of tasks with exceptions that have to be defined. But the beauty of defining an automation process is all the little pieces of it are objects, kind of an object library for reuse. So once you have a process for onboarding an HR service for a new worker or something like that, it's highly repeatable. But the other thing is any set of objects can be put in a different order. So if you define everything for onboarding, it's very easy to apply the logic for offboarding. If you are going to apply rights to someone, you can set policies, so just-in-time rights access, or for team rights for a collaboration exercise, or for M&A activity. So all of that capability is really coming to the forefront now with COVID-19. But you, as I said earlier, think you want this agility going forward. The more that you script, the more you make things brittle, the more difficult it is to have exceptions to scripts. Having a low code or no code environment is becoming much more strategic because the people who own the business process are much closer to actualizing the workflow solution. You still need IT, you still need IT risk, you still need people to have the chargeback, show back, the due diligence to make sure that everything is operating appropriately and being audited and reported appropriately to whatever compliance organizations you're liable to. But the idea of what has to be done for the business value, for the outcomes we talked about earlier, you want to enable the business to do that in the most agile way possible. And I think that's what we're finding out is people are discovering for the first time, even though these technologies have been around for a few years, how it can be applied now. And it's really amazing that it is changing, onboarding and offboarding from an onerous thing to a BAU event.
Excellent. If I were to kind of add a couple of things from a CIO perspective, I see, tools and technologies are like a means to an end than the end itself. So yes, automation is a tool and a capability, and we need a technology that would allow us to use that capability in a best-in-class way from experts, companies like Blue Prism and others. But we look at it as what is the business process that we are trying to optimize? What is the outcome pre and post automation? And before I was at S&P Global over the last 3 years, and the company already had like a process culture with the lean methodologies applied. So it was actually easy for a company like us to kind of bring in automation because we are already, Six Sigma, lean, process and process engineering type organization. I think that kind of dovetails into a conversation, a question that we have in the system, which is prior to COVID, we had a mix of on-premise and virtual workers. As we currently are in all virtual work environment, new efficiencies are born and cultivated. And the question is, the post-COVID environment will change this mix again. How will the new human capital management systems need to be adjusted to evaluate developer and non-developer productivities during these transitions? And effectively what we're saying is that are the metrics for success for developers and non-development community change as a result of COVID? And then, how does the performance management, human capital management solutions change? And hopefully I, recasted the question appropriately. So maybe I'll take a stab at it, and from an S&P Global and as a CIO perspective, and Eric, you can add on to it. Whenever we are talking about productivity, again, what has changed with COVID is where we work has changed, but the work has not changed. So where we do the work has changed, but the actual work and the outcomes have not changed. Because we are a agile and a process driven organization, we already have metrics on how do we measure ourselves, whether it is in infrastructure on your SLAs and OLAs, or whether it is from a developer perspective, how many story points we would earn, what is the definition of done that we need to do as part of your agile process, or on the business front, how long does it take for us to take a transcript from an earnings call and publish it into the platform. All of these things are, very agile teams, small teams, and they had the SLAs and OLAs, and the way we measure those SLAs isn't going to change. So from my perspective, COVID hasn't changed how we measure the business outcomes. I think what it has changed, though, however, is how do we work together? How can we, the collaboration tools that we need to invest in? How do we make it easy to build those relationships of trust that we need to have as we deliver large initiatives? Those are the areas we are focusing on from a tools and technology and metrics perspective. Then, developer productivity, we are very comfortable with how we're doing before, and COVID hasn't changed that. Eric?
So again, it may be that we are aligning our messages. I'm using slightly different language. But I agree that your business outcomes are the same. You have a core competency, and what you do in ratings and everything else at S&P is persistent. I completely agree. I think as you adopt new tools and you integrate these tools and you automate these tools, and people are now freed up to do some more innovation on business processes, I think you are going to see some net new niches that you're creating for business outcomes. You're probably going to explore some other adjacent areas to what you do in your core competency. So I agree that your business and the metrics around its outcome are consistent and persistent, but I think you're going to see some expansion and a reassessment over time because you're going to have that flexibility because of the automation and additional tools. Getting back to the developers, I used the term earlier, low code or no code. You still need developers, but you and I have been doing this for a while, and there was the question maybe 15 years ago, do you teach the business people to be developers, or do you teach the developers to be business people? And there is that question, is that either or? And I think that's finally resolving itself. Is you're going to have a technically literate set of business people. I see the more successful developers understand the underlying business processes that they're writing code for. If you teach those people to create an object library for reuse, to explore services, PaaS services or SaaS services as a first run and modifying to need. So buy versus build, because you can buy or rebuy what you need just in time. I think there'll be a lot less longhand coding. Matter of fact, there's a lot of AI the major cloud providers use to already do QA testing, and you're starting to see certain modules of web design that are completely artificially generated. So I do see that some of the metrics for the journey will change. You were right about the KPIs and the SLAs for the outcomes. Those will be consistent. But how we go on that journey, that's going to change quite a bit. And I like one thing you said earlier, and we both mentioned earlier, it's culture. One nice thing about dealing with S&P, one of the nicest interactions I've had since I joined Blue Prism was being invited to your lead expo on-prem last year and seeing how you invest in everyone's technical literacy. It's not just the new hires. I saw people from 25 to 65 all in the same room to learn about the future, and it's sponsored, I believe, by your chief risk officer. And she took it seriously, because when you have that knowledge, you write better code. When you have that knowledge, you have better business outcomes. When you have that knowledge going in, your outcome is going to be better. So I think having that cultural mindset that this is how people will interact in the future, and get acculturated to using these services and potentially having these digital twins, as we talked about earlier, that's a huge cultural change. But the value is going to be tremendous. And then you're going to modify the KPIs for the person. You're going to reward the human individuals more for their innovative, atypical work. But the SLAs for what they produce and how it's consumed and the value it has for you and your customers, well, of course, that's going to channel back into, the traditional business value.
So Eric, there is a question here, which I'm sure probably is a question that a lot of people have in mind. And I'll take a stab at it, and then I'll let you chime in. It's a very important question. Automation and in general, some of these new age technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, there's this notion that they are going to reduce the human efforts involved. And that, a lot of people read it as, reduction in jobs and so on and so forth, right? So how do you, is that true? And then how do you really, deal with it, these concepts in the companies so that you carry your employees to these new technologies? And how do you really manage, this learning to the organization is the question. Mm-hmm. So I can tell you for sure that what's happening is the data is growing leaps and bounds. I remember maybe 15 years ago, having a database of a terabyte. There were only like 30 or 40 companies that have a database of 1 terabyte or more. But nowadays, fast forward 15 years from that time, having a almost every company probably has a database that is terabyte or more content, right? So data is increasing, right? Even petabyte, right? So if we do not adopt the new age tools and technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and automation, we won't be able to grow the employees at the rate at which data, compute, and the opportunities are growing. The only way to kind of beat that curve and still continue to provide insights and value is to use some of these, techniques that are out there, that are mature and that are evolving. And when you embrace them, first and foremost, you can do a lot more to your customers. But more importantly, it allows the kind of like the associate that's involved to embark on new areas and develop new insights for our customers. So we as an organization have embraced automation early on, really started as a grassroots activity. And I was talking to our head of our COE for automation, Dish, and he was mentioning that we started with 3 Blue Prism licenses on day one, mm-hmm. and slowly success and value contributed to more value and more success, and it proliferated. It's like a grassroots exercise, and now we have hundreds of robots And I'll have a funny story, and then I'll let you know, Eric. I know this is very close to your heart, and I'm sure you have comments on it. You know, last year I got, you know, we do these compliance trainings, and it's mandatory, and there's a deadline for compliance training. And then, you know, my scorecard said that my organization was only 90% compliant on taking these compliance training classes. And then I was like, you know, furious and say, hey, how come? And then I said, you know, give me the list of, everybody said that, all my directs said that, look, we are 100%, but the data shows it's 90%. We realize that all the robots also need to have a login and an account, and they're all registered in my organization. And unfortunately, robots don't need to take compliance classes. So you know, it's very interesting that you know, we count robots as humans in the system, because you need to set up an email account and so on and so forth, but they don't have to take compliance class. And I thought that that's funny. But you know, S&P Global has embraced automation and machine learning and data science, and we have been contributing a lot of value as a result of these tools, and our employees embraced it. Eric, your thoughts?
So many points to go after, but let me go through your last one first. That's a very nice insight that your digital workers didn't complete their risk and compliance, but remember, they did the day that they took the job. In other words, you built them to be compliant, and they can't vary from that. They're never going to browse the internet during lunch. They're never going to open an attachment to an email that was never in prescribed work. They're never going to have social engineering worked against them. They'll never be able to show an access point to an application other through the prescriptive function that they were trained to work with. So no, you won't have to certify them semi-annually, but you will certify them when you assign them work, right? So it's a different way of looking at it. It's the exact same compliance requirement, but it's administered to the workers in a different way, depending if they're virtual or human. Getting on to the idea of the future of work, matter of fact, that was a nice opportunity at the Leeds Expo at S&P, where I talked about the future work. I've been updating the post-COVID-19 future of work presentation that I gave. And I'm actually writing a thought piece right now about the next industrial revolution, which I believe 5.0 is going to be here thanks to COVID-19 much earlier than anticipated. And quick summary, the first industrial revolution, barely 2 centuries ago, was all about energy. How did it stop being people, oxen, and horses, and start being water and then steam and then electricity? Second industrial revolution was all about infrastructure. So rather than having a cottage industry here or there, you would have the roads and the communications and the way of having distribution to market. The third industrial revolution was the data revolution. And that's in our careers. You and I were towards the beginning of that. The distributed computing was the instantiation of the data revolution. And now data was king, right? It's the new oil. Because based on that, and as you said earlier in the session, how you're dealing with COVID-19, you start with the data. We still think that way, and it's still important. And the fourth industrial revolution, which everyone's touting right now, is AI. Right now, you're going to be able to have these capabilities algorithmically doing more proactive work and giving you insights you couldn't have with that data you didn't have before. I think the fifth industrial revolution is going to be autonomous automation. Certain things are going to be done. They're going to be done right. They're going to be done with minimal human supervision or only by predefined exceptions where you need humans in the loop. But the reason I'm giving you this context is the first industrial revolution didn't put people out of work. It created a whole new set of jobs to maintain and build out all of the energy around canals, to all of the steam engines, and then now the steamboats, and then everything else that came with steam. And then in the second industrial revolution, building the roads and the telecommunications and the radio antennas and everything that went with that. And now the new infrastructure on Main Street that was enabled by that. And then the data revolution. People thought that back in the 90s, maybe even the 80s, you're going to save forests because you won't need paper anymore. And we almost took out the forest in the 80s because everyone printed out the backup copies of everything that they were analyzing, right? And remember the continuous feed paper, the pallets of it coming through the loading docks? But we didn't lose people. You had higher trained, higher value people who were the linemen and the road engineers, who now the data architects and the data engineers. And now who are the highest esteemed, hardest to get resources in IT today or in an organization today? They'd be your data scientists and your analysts. And now we're hitting the next revolution. And I think it's the people who can adapt and work with automation and leverage it to be productive in new ways. I don't see it taking away jobs unless you're dependent on something that didn't have high value. If your job before was to copy and paste between these 5 screens on your desktop, and at the end of the day, your KPIs were just how many times you could copy and paste without making an error, yeah, you might start worrying. That's no longer the ante for doing your job well. If your job is having empathy with customers and having time with them to make sure that their satisfaction rates are continuously going up, your job is not in jeopardy. You're just going to have more tools to enable you to deal with those customers. These are the examples. So no, it's an attitude, partly to be true. It is a cultural change, which we talked about. But the new normal is people have to be comfortable not doing what they did yesterday. And that's how change has always been constant, but we've never really had the tools to mitigate change until probably the last 15 years. And now it's really, how are we going to rediscover ourselves? What could we really do with the 10, 20, 30 hours a week that you'll be freed up not doing things that were mundane? And I'm sure you'll be working a lot of 10-hour days on new and interesting projects because there's always going to be a need for that innovation which comes from people.
Excellent. We have 6 minutes left, and then maybe I'll take a final question, and then we'll see. Maybe have some closing remarks from both of us, Eric, in the next 6 minutes. So the question came in email. What does the next iteration of VDI, virtual desktop, looks like, and how do you see what further advancing the digital or remote worker? So let me take that question, and then Eric, you can add to it.
Sure.
So one of the things that COVID has enlightened a lot of the CIOs is the dependency of the legacy technologies that everyone has, and the reliance on VDI as a substitute to deal with the technologies that are still legacy. And these are not your not everybody has web-enabled their applications. They're still legacy thick client applications, and those thick client applications are very sensitive to network traffic. And network latency. So there's a uptick in VDI usage, and everybody has VDI footprint. What we are seeing, and we are actually working very closely with a couple of cloud providers on accelerating more VDI deployments, so that when we have people who are working in remote locations, they still have that experience of working inside the data center, even though their application, their interface is sitting in a country where the last mile access is not something that we have an opportunity to influence. So the next generation of VDIs, in my mind, is these cloud providers, AWS, Azure, and Citrix. They're going to see an uptick in their VDI or remote desktop as a service, and we are actually playing with some of them, and very pleased with some of the speed at which we can get things done with remote desktop as a service with some of the cloud providers. I wanted to see, Eric, if you have any thoughts.
I see things moving that will be part of the movement. I see things going in a different direction. Because of my experience kind of as an infrastructure architect in financials on Wall Street back in the noughts, about 20 years ago. And I remember the whole stack and find the choke point. And if you want to simplify the challenge of most applications, is you want all of the components to be as close to the same backbone as possible, right? You want the data and the application logic in the middle layer, whatever that is. You want the channels to it to all be on the same backplane if possible. The faster the better. The thing about a digital worker is it doesn't live on a desktop. It doesn't live in a distributed space. It resides on a server or on a cloud service. You should put it right on the same backplane as your data service. So if you can now have a multi-channel service that the digital worker can communicate to people through, And it could be, and I actually did a podcast on this several months ago about intergenerational collaboration with digital workers. Some people like to work by email. Other people like to work by text. Other people like to work by voice messaging and calls. Other people have a combination of different things. You can have all these channels, and with natural language processing from the cloud providers and others, you can actually train digital workers to work in different channels with different people, all with the same data. So you're going to actually probably redefine the user experience dramatically, and it's not going to be another way of distributing the current UI. It's going to be much more of a dynamic interface. And when people need that information, why go to this thick client rendering and have 5 pages and go 3-6 clicks to get to the data? If it needs my approval, show me the field of information, criteria for the approval, and the button that says yes or no. And that's all I'm going to need for that experience. So I see it, we're going to transform the digital, the user experience, the digital interface as part of this transformation. Now, the transition based on the complexity of the legacy environments, you're going to need VDI, but I don't see it as the answer. I see it as a gateway. Once you have a portal into the centralized set of functions and data, I see the transformation coming to the user experience through those the channels with digital workers.
Excellent. Look, Eric, thank you very much for joining and sharing your thoughts, and thanks to Blue Prism for sponsoring today's WSTA's first Ask the Expert event. You know, for all the participants and attendees on the call, look, technology is a great business to be in. A lot has been happening, and with COVID, some new problems and new challenges that are coming our way. It's good to be in the business of technology. Good luck. Engage with your peers. Or check out wsta.org, and we look forward to seeing you all in future events as we help each other with knowledge, and also exchange ideas as you navigate this complex, environment, and make, and try to plan your career forward through the learnings. With that, have a wonderful time. We're talking to you all.